Greetings, viewers, and welcome to today's info sharing snippet. We will be covering the Sage 200 Evolution interbranch transfers feature. Now, as the name implies, an interbranch transfer allows you to move stock items from one location to the other and keep track of the movement of those stock items from the point of dispatch, the point of en route, as well as the point when those goods are received at the receiving warehouse. Let's see exactly how this process unfolds. Now, before we begin processing interbranch transfers, we need to go to our warehouse defaults. It's under Inventory Maintenance, Warehouse Defaults. And there's an option for interbranch transfers. So I'm going to go to interbranch transfers. And firstly, we need to activate the interbranch transfers feature. So I'm going to click on that option. And what we have there is we've got a specific transaction code for interbranch transfers, which forms part of the warehouse transfers transaction type. We then also have an additional supplier costs transaction type. So there may be instances whereby when moving items from one location to the other, you make use of a third party, for example, a transport company. And those costs that you incur when moving items from one location to the other would need to be incorporated into the IBT. We also specify a default receiving cost, either being the item cost or the issuing cost. And then very importantly, there's three areas which we need to incorporate into warehouse transfers, or interbranch transfers. These include a goods in transit warehouse, a variance transfer warehouse, and a damaged goods warehouse. Now, with goods in transit, it really is the process of when the goods have left the dispatching warehouse and are then en route to the receiving warehouse. So that's the area where the goods would be in transit. We then have a variance goods warehouse, and this scenario would occur when the goods or the units dispatched from the dispatching warehouse are different from the goods or the items or quantities which are received at the receiving warehouse. Damaged goods means is that the goods that were dispatched from the dispatching warehouse are damaged upon arrival at the receiving warehouse, and these goods will then need to be incorporated into a damaged goods warehouse. Now, very importantly is that when you activate interbranch transfers for the first time, the goods in transit, variance, and damaged goods warehouses are created automatically. So I'm just going to, at this point, specify a goods in transit warehouse, a variance goods warehouse, and a damaged goods warehouse. Right, so we've specified those warehouses, and now we can go on to the interbranch transfer numbering option. And when processing interbranch transfer, you're going to have an interbranch transfer number as well as the delivery note, and then we can, at this point, implement automatic numbering for those two documents. So I'm going to be using automatic numbering for the IBT as well as for the delivery note. And if I go to my interbranch transfers, I've activated the feature. I have my transaction codes, and then also I've specified the three default warehouses for damaged goods, variance goods, and goods in transit. Right, so now I can commence with the process of an interbranch transfer, where I'm going to be moving goods from one warehouse to the other. Under inventory transactions, I have a warehouse IBT issue. And if I open up that option, I've got my interbranch transfer. So there's my IBT number. The current state is set to unprocessed, and there I've got my delivery note number. At this point, I can insert a description and some references, and also link this interbranch transfer to a project. On the right-hand side, I would now need to specify the dispatching warehouse and the receiving warehouse, and then I've got my goods in transit, variance goods, and damaged goods warehouse specified automatically on my IBT. In this instance, I'm going to move items from the master warehouse to one of the other warehouses. And now it's simply a case of on the line specifying which items I'm going to be moving from one location to the other, as well as the quantities that are going to be moved. So I've got my item code there, and I'm just going to, tells me that currently in the master warehouse, that's my quantity available, and I'm simply going to specify how many units am I going to be moving, and then simply insert a reference. And you'll notice is that if I am moving a unit of measure item, I can specify the unit of measure, as well as if it's a serialized number or a lot numbered item, I can specify the lot number or the serial number on the lines of the IBT. Right, so I'm just going to have a couple of items that I'm going to be moving from one location to the other. Right, and there we go. Okay, so I've got my items, the quantities to be moved, my from and my to warehouse, and I've got my document numbers. It's going to validate this transaction. Right, all is in order in the IBT transfer transaction, and I'm going to say process. Okay. At this point, I'm going to have the opportunity to print a picking slip. So I'm going to say yes to that. And if I preview the picking slip, it's going to give me details of the from and the to warehouse, the items that need to be picked, as also the quantities, and details about the IBT number, and also that's now going to be moved into goods in transit warehouse. Right, next we have the ability to print an IBT delivery note. Now this document is going to accompany the goods from the dispatching warehouse into the transport vehicle, and then going to be accompany those goods when they arrive at the receiving warehouse. So let's say yes to that. And if we preview the IBT delivery note, you'll see that once again, I've got the items, the from and the to warehouse, together with the quantities that were issued, as well as a delivery note number. So I've got my details there. And as I say, when the goods arrive at the receiving warehouse, the person checking, validating the quantities would then use this document to determine exactly how many were issued, and then compare that to the quantities received on those items. Right, so we've completed the IBT, and now those goods have then moved into a goods in transit area. So I'm just going to go to my inventory inquiries, and let's just go through to our transaction history, and let's just see exactly, there's an item. And if I go to my view, you'll see that we've got the option whereby the goods have moved out of the master warehouse and they've now moved into the goods in transit warehouse as they're en route to the receiving warehouse. Right, so if I now go to, for example, to warehouses, you'll see that we've got 55 in our master warehouse, and we've got 5 in goods in transit and 5 in our Cape Town warehouse. So we've got details for currently of quantity now in goods in transit. And I'm now going to, at this point, go and receipt the goods. So when the goods arrive at the receiving warehouse, those goods would then need to be received. Right, so there's 2 ways of doing it. You either go under My Desktop. So the branch would then log into the database, and under My Desktop, there's an option for IBT receipts due. Right, they would then see that there's an IBT due where the goods have physically arrived. And we've got the from warehouse, the to warehouse, and currently they're now in goods in transit. Right, so I can either receive the IBT from the My Desktop IBT receipts due feature. Alternatively, I can go to inventory transactions, and we have a warehouse IBT receive option. So I'm going to go in there. I'm simply going to click on the open button, and I'm going to look for or filter on the specific date. And then under my IBT state, I'm going to look for in transit. So I can either look for completed, in transit, or all. So we know that this IBT is in transit. And if I say find, I've then got my IBT, which is waiting to be receipted or received. So I'm just going to run there. And then as you see, there's the IBT lines which were dispatched previously from the dispatching warehouse. And now it's simply a case of using the delivery note and comparing the quantities of the delivery note with what was physically received at the receiving warehouse. So, for example, there's my item, and it tells me that currently there were 5 in goods in transit. And for example, 5 units were received. Okay, and what you notice is that the quantity now there is 0. Quantity outstanding is now set to 0. Right, so next item, for example, we're saying 6 were dispatched in the goods in transit, and for example, 4 were received, and we then got perhaps 2 that were damaged. And that leaves the quantity outstanding as 0. And then, for example, on this particular one, we've got 7 that were set to goods in transit. And for example, maybe we received 6, and we've got 1 which was in variance, which was unaccounted for. So what we have now is a scenario where on the first line, 5 were dispatched, 5 were received, no quantities outstanding. On line number 2, there was 6 dispatched. We received 4 and 2 were damaged. On the third line, we've got 7 that were dispatched, 6 were received, and 1 was unaccounted for. Right, so at this point, we can also incorporate the additional cost that I spoke about previously. So in this instance, you may have used a transport company to move the goods from one location to the other. And now I'm going to allocate the additional costs to this IBT. So I'm going to say additional costs, and I'm going to say allocate additional costs. Right, at this point, I can allocate those costs per line, or I can say a total additional cost. So say, for example, there was maybe a charge of 400 to move those items. And at this point, I can determine exactly the cost, or allocate those costs to a supplier. I've got my supplier there, and I can insert, for example, the supplier invoice number. And I can specify a description. Okay, and then insert the amount of the cost together with the relevant tax type. Right, so at this point, I've allocated 400, which equals additional cost. There's no difference, and I can say OK. Right, so as you can see there, I've got details about the additional cost at the bottom of the screen, and I specified the items that were received, etc. And I'm just going to validate. There we go, validation successful. And now it's simply a case of processing this IBT. Save the changes, yes. Okay. At this point, I've got the opportunity to print an IBT receive note. Now, this document would be printed at the receiving head office or the receiving branch or warehouse, which just gives details about what was received. So that's information about the from and the to warehouse. I've got details about the items that were received, the quantity that was issued from the dispatching warehouse, quantity received, if there were any variances or any damaged goods, and I've got a breakdown there of exactly what was received at the receiving warehouse. Right, so I can complete that, and I'm good to go. So that is the whole IBT issue and receive process. Now, there could be instances whereby you have an organization which has a head office together with branches, and the head office then purchases stock on behalf of the branches. We can then add an additional step into the IBT process, which includes a transaction called a warehouse IBT requisition. In this instance, the branch would then process an IBT requisition requesting stock from the head office, and then the head office will then determine if they have stock available, and then if so, they would then begin the process of approving the requisition and then moving the items through a normal IBT process from the head office to the relevant branch. Right, so I'm going to go to warehouse IBT requisition, and you notice that I have an IBT requisition number, and the status is currently set to unprocessed request. So once again, I can insert a description, a reference, etc. And now I'm going to specify the warehouse where the item is going to be requested from, in this case, the master warehouse. And for example, the warehouse that is requesting the goods. So there we go. And I'm going to specify the goods in transit warehouse. Right. So now it's simply a case of saying which items am I requesting. Right. Quantity. You see that the status is now set to request. Right, and then it's simply a case of specifying the required items, the quantity, Now, very interesting, you'll notice that on the top of the screen, there's an option called or a tab for stock levels. So at this particular point, the requesting branch can simply go to stock levels. They can see exactly the quantity available at the master warehouse and then determine if there is sufficient stock for them to request at the master warehouse. So as you can see in this instance, the available quantity is 55, the request is for 7, 75 available, request is for 9, 70 available, and the request is for 8. So as you can see in this particular instance, the branch can then see that the warehouse does, or the master warehouse does have sufficient quantity to be able to meet their request. Right, so I can close that and just complete this IBT requisition. Right, so I'm just going to validate. All in order. So what we have here, we've got our items, the requested quantity, and the from and the to warehouse, as well as the goods in transit warehouse. So I've got my IBT requisition number, and I'm going to say process. Right. At this point, I'm able to print a document called a request note. And this just allows the requesting branch to keep a record of exactly what it is, or the items that they requested from the head office. So I've got my from and my to warehouse. I've got my items, the quantities requested of those items, as well as the status as being requested. So I can close that, and I've got my details of what items requested. And now if I go to my desktop, you'll see the option that says IBT requisitions due. And there we have it. So I've got my IBT requisition. I've got the from to warehouse and the status being requested. I'm going to go edit this IBT requisition. So at this particular point, the head office is logged in. They have seen that there's an IBT requisition received from a branch. And now they would simply go in and check the requisition quantities. And they can simply go to our stock levels tab and see that, yes, they do have quantity available of these particular items in order for them to meet the requests of the branch. So I'm going to say close there. And now it's simply a case of saying how many are they going to be dispatching to the particular branch. So in this particular instance, 7 are required. And once again, they can approve the 7, and they can change the status from being request to approve. Okay. Right, so in this particular instance, say, for example, that although 8 have been requested, for example, perhaps the branch or the head office can only accommodate them with, say, for example, 7 units. So they can still set that to be approved. However, they can't request or accommodate the branch for the full quantity that they requested. Then finally, it may be a case where they don't have stock available for this particular item. It could be reserved for some other customer. So it'll simply be a case of, they would say 0 being approved, and they would simply set the status to be rejected. Right, so in this particular instance, line 1, 7 requested, 7 approved. Status has now been set to approve. Line number 2, 8 requested, however, only 7 have been approved. The status has still been approved. And then finally, it could be, as I mentioned, that the head office doesn't have sufficient quantities to meet the request of the branch, so they would approve 0 quantity and then just reject that particular line on the actual requisition. Right, so I'm going to just say validate that, and all looks in order, and I can then continue with the process. So I've got my details there, and I'm going to say process. At this particular point, the head office or the branch is going to be dispatching the goods can print a document called an approval note. Right, so there's my approval note, and it's just going to give me details about the from and the to warehouse, the items that have been requested by the branch or the warehouse, and you'll see that it's got the number of units requested, the number of units approved, and the status of those particular line items. So there we have 7 required, 7 approved. That instance was whereby the branch or the head office could not sort of accommodate the branch, and this particular instance where they could only accommodate a portion of the units that were required or requested. Right, I'm going to say close there. And I'm now going to, if you look at, you see you've got the option, for example, IBT notifications. And what this simply is that if we then go into the IBT notification, it really is when the branch logs in, they'll see that there has been a notification for them concerning the request that they've made, and they can see exactly that the lines, certain lines have been approved, there's a rejected line, and they can see exactly what stock the head office can accommodate them with, and will be dispatching to them via the normal IBT process. Right, so there's my approval note, and I'm just going to say close. Right, and now it's simply a case of going to my IBT issues due, and we can begin the process. So there we go. Okay, there we have our IBT. Okay, and what you notice at this particular point is that the item or the line item that was rejected does not appear on this particular transaction. And now it's simply a case of saying, right, 7 have been approved, quantity issued was the same amount. At this particular point, we can also go and change the relevant issued transaction. Okay, right, so simply a case of completing that, and I think we're good to go. And then it's simply a case of saying validate, all in order, process the transaction, and once again, print the picking slip. So we know exactly which items are going to be picked and loaded onto the vehicle to be transported to the receiving warehouse. We have our delivery note, which is going to be used to check and validate the quantities dispatched versus the quantities received. There we go. And we're good to go. So now it's simply a case of the branch would then log in, see that there's an IBT receipt due. They would simply go in and open up the IBT receipt. Right, we've got our items there, At this particular point, it's now moved from goods in transit into the receiving warehouse. And they're simply going to say, for example, in this instance, there were 7 which were in goods in transit. And we can then say, for example, received the 7. So no discrepancies there. And perhaps out of those 7 also dispatched. For example, maybe 6 were received and there was 1 which happens to be damaged. Right, so there we go. That's the process. And once again, simply validate. Okay, let's just go and change this slightly. Quantity received, let's just say 7. Six and damaged 1. Save, and then we can validate. Right, validate successfully, and now it's simply a case of processing the transaction, and we can continue with the whole process. Right, so I think we're good to go, and we can then complete the IBT receive. Right, so I'm just going to say process that transaction. We can print the IBT receive note, yes. Preview, and I'm good to go. So I can close that screen. I've got the issued quantity, received, variance, and damaged. And I'm simply going to say close. And there we go. And there we have the IBT process, or interbranch transfer process. So it really is a case of having items moving from a dispatching warehouse to receiving warehouse. This will then receive the goods that were dispatched, and if applicable, they would allocate them to perhaps a damaged goods warehouse or perhaps a variance goods warehouse if applicable. And then taking that a step further is simply implementing or incorporating IBT requisition, whereby you could then have a scenario where a warehouse or branch would then request items from the head office. The head office can then determine if they are able to, if they have stock available, if they accommodate, and if they can accommodate the requisition from the branch. If so, process a requisition at the head office, and then from there, issue the items via the normal IBT issue process, and then dispatch them to the relevant receiving branch. So as you can see, a very useful way to keep track of items being moved between one location to the other, from the point of dispatch, the process of being en route to the receiving warehouse, and upon receipt, receiving those items, etc. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's over and out for me, and goodbye.